The torrential downpour had finally stopped when Emma Hartwell heard the desperate pounding on her farmhouse door. Opening it, she found a bloodied woman in tattered hiking clothes barely conscious on her porch. 24 hours later, that same porch would be surrounded by Secret Service agents. A presidential motorcade would be rolling through her neglected apple orchard, and national news cameras would be broadcasting live from her property. How could a simple act of compassion transform a struggling farmer's life overnight? The answer begins with a storm, a stranger, and a woman who refused to give up on the land she loved. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mid-October rain battered against Emma Hartwell's farmhouse. Windows with a vengeance, as if the very sky was expressing the frustration she felt looking at her bank statements. Outside, the wind howled through the century-old oak trees that bordered her property, sending cascades of golden leaves swirling across the struggling fields of Wild Wind's farm. Inside, Emma sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by bills illuminated by a single hanging light fixture, the only one she kept on these days to save on electricity. Her weathered hands, bearing the calluses and tiny scars of 15 years of farm work, cradled a mug of chamomile tea she'd grown herself. It was almost laughable. She could grow herbs that high-end organic markets in the city charged fortune. For yet she couldn't make her mortgage payment this month. The irony wasn't lost on her as she stared at the final notice from Heartland Agricultural Bank, their threatening language thinly veiled in corporate courtesy. Mrs. Hartwell, as you have failed to meet the adjusted payment schedule, we generously, provided we must inform you that foreclosure proceedings will commence within 30 days. Generously provided, Emma scoffed, her breath rippling the surface of her tea. There had been nothing generous about the predatory refinancing agreement they'd pressured her into after last year's drought had decimated her corn crop. The interest rate had nearly doubled, the term shortened, and the fine print had included clauses that made it almost impossible for a small organic operation like hers to comply with their suddenly stringent environmental standards. Lightning flashed, momentarily transforming the kitchen window into a mirror. Emma caught her reflection. At 42, her once vibrant auburn hair now streaked with premature grey, pulled back in a practical ponytail. The laugh lines around her eyes had deepened into worry lines that remained even when her face was at rest. She barely recognized herself these days. The kitchen around her told the story of both her heritage and her current struggles. Mason jars of preserved vegetables lined the shelves, the fruits of her labor lovingly canned to stretch through winter. Her grandmother's cast iron pans hung from hooks on the wall, seasoned by generations of Hartwell women who had cooked hearty meals for farmers coming in from the fields. A blue ribbon from the county fair, won 3 years ago for her heirloom tomatoes, was pinned next to a calendar marked with payment deadlines she couldn't meet. Behind her, a pot of homemade vegetable soup simmered on the ancient stove. The rich aroma of fresh carrots, onions, celery, and herbs from her kitchen garden filled the room, one small comfort she could still afford. The radio on the counter crackled with static as the local station broadcasted weather warnings. The meteorologist's voice faded in and out, predicting another 3 hours of severe thunderstorms and possible flash flooding in Madison County. Emma rose from the table with a sigh, moving to stir the soup. Outside, another jagged bolt of lightning split the sky, followed almost immediately by a boom of thunder that shook the farmhouse to its foundation. The lights flickered ominously. She glanced at the emergency lanterns she'd already placed strategically. Around the kitchen, power outages were common on the rural grid during storms like this. "Not tonight," she muttered to the empty room. "Just hold on until morning." She wasn't sure if she was talking to the electricity, the roof that had developed a minor leak last spring, or herself. The grandfather clock in the hallway, another. Hartwell heirloom chimed 8 times. Normally by this hour, Emma would see the twinkling lights of neighboring farms dotting the landscape outside her window, a comforting reminder that she wasn't entirely alone out here. But those lights had been going dark one by one over the past 2 years as corporate farming operations bought out struggling family farms across the county. The Wilsons had been the first to go, their dairy operation unable to compete with industrial-scale producers. Then the Johnsons' century-old apple orchard, followed by the Mendez family's vegetable farm. Each sale had sent ripples of anxiety through the remaining independent farmers. Each foreclosure auction had attracted the same group of corporate representatives, their identical suits and calculating expressions as they assessed generations of agricultural heritage in terms of potential profit. Emma ladled the soup into a bowl and carried it to the kitchen table, pushing aside the bills to make room. Her dinner was accompanied by a slice of homemade bread, the last from a loaf she'd baked 3 days ago. As the wind rattled the window panes, she found herself mentally cataloguing tomorrow's tasks. The north fence needed mending, the winter squash needed harvesting before the frost, and somehow she needed to find a way to make a partial payment to the bank to buy herself more time. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden, frantic barking of her border collie, Rusty. The dog had been sleeping peacefully by the wood stove, but now stood alert, his ears perked toward the front of the house. "What is it, boy?" Emma asked, setting down her spoon. Rusty's barking took on a more urgent tone as he raced to the front door, pawing at the worn threshold. Then she heard it, barely audible above the storm's fury, a pounding on her front door. Emma tensed. Visitors were rare at Wild Winds Farm these days and unheard of during weather like this. The county road that led to her property became nearly impassable during heavy rains. The gravel washed out in places and mud-slicked in others. Who would brave such conditions to reach her isolated farmhouse? She approached the door cautiously, years of living alone having taught her prudence. Through the rain-streaked window beside the door, she could make out a figure hunched on her porch, one hand braced against the wall as if for support. The porch light, triggered by motion, illuminated the stranger enough for Emma to see it was a woman, her clothing plastered to her body by the rain. "Hello!" Emma called out, her hand hesitating on the deadbolt. "Who's there?" The response was faint, nearly drowned by a crash of thunder. "Please, help!" Something in the voice, raw desperation tinged with pain, cut through Emma's caution. She unbolted the door and pulled it open, immediately feeling the force of the wind, trying to wrench it from her grasp. The woman on her porch was in worse shape than Emma had initially thought. Mid-30s, perhaps, with short dark hair now plastered to her head. She wore what had once been expensive hiking gear, now torn and muddied. Most alarmingly, a dark stain that looked sickeningly like blood soaked her left side, and her face was deathly pale beneath a gash on her forehead. "Oh my God!" Emma gasped, immediately reaching out to support the stranger as she swayed dangerously. "Come inside, quickly!" The woman took one stumbling step forward before her legs gave out entirely. Emma caught her, surprised by her own strength as she half-carried, half-dragged the unconscious woman into the warmth of her home. Rusty circled them anxiously, whining as Emma kicked the door shut against the storm. "It's okay, boy," she murmured, though she was far from certain of that herself. She managed to get the woman to the living room sofa, easing her down as gently as possible. Up close, her condition was even more alarming. The hiking clothes were high quality, but showed signs of a rough journey, torn in places, caked with mud in others. The cut on her forehead was still oozing blood, and when Emma carefully lifted the woman's jacket to check the wound on her side, she found a deep gash that needed immediate attention. Years of farm accidents had made Emma no stranger to emergency first aid. She worked quickly, retrieving her well-stocked medical kit from the bathroom and a basin of warm water from the kitchen. As she cleaned and dressed the wound on the woman's side, she noticed other details. The woman's hands, though, currently dirty and scraped, showed none of the calluses of physical labor. Her watch was a sleek, expensive model, and peeking from the torn pocket of her hiking pants was what looked like some kind of official identification. The stranger moaned softly as Emma applied antiseptic to the head wound, her eyelids fluttering, but not opening. For now, stopping the bleeding and warming her up took priority over questions. Emma worked methodically, applying butterfly bandages to the head wound, then wrapping the deeper injury on the woman's side with gauze and medical tape. She covered her with a thick quilt, hand-stitched by her grandmother, and placed a pillow beneath her head. Only when the immediate medical needs were addressed did Emma allow herself to wonder exactly who she had brought into her home. Madison County had its share of hiking trails that attracted tourists from the city, but they were miles from her property. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And no casual hiker would be out in weather like this, nor would they carry what appeared to be government identification. Emma's gaze settled on the partial ID card visible in the torn pocket. She hesitated only briefly before carefully extracting it, telling herself it was to identify the injured woman, perhaps find emergency contacts. But the logo on the badge made her blood run cold. The presidential seal was unmistakable, as was the department identification. Executive Office of the D. President Catherine Morgan, Deputy Environmental Policy Advisor, Emma read aloud, her voice barely a whisper. The photo matched the unconscious woman on her sofa, though it showed her looking considerably more polished in a business suit rather than torn hiking gear. Emma sank into the armchair across from the sofa, badge still in hand, mind racing. What was a White House advisor doing hiking near her farm during a thunderstorm? And more importantly, what had happened to leave her injured and desperate on Emma's doorstep? Before she could process the implications, Catherine Morgan's eyes snapped open. For a moment, she looked disoriented, eyes darting around the unfamiliar room before settling on Emma. Then her gaze dropped to the ID badge in Emma's hand, and her expression shifted from confusion to what looked almost like resignation. "I suppose," she said, her voice hoarse but surprisingly steady, "this complicates things." Emma found herself at a loss for words, an unusual state for a woman who had bargained with bank managers and argued with agricultural suppliers regularly. You were hurt. I was looking for emergency contacts," she finally managed, though it sounded weak even to her own ears. Catherine, if that was really her name, attempted to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at her bandaged side. "Thank you for helping me. For this," she gestured to the bandages. "Not many people would open their door to a stranger during a storm like this." Emma set the badge on the coffee table between them, suddenly conscious of how unusual this situation was. "What happened to you? And what is someone from the White House doing out here?" Catherine glanced toward the window where rain continued to lash against the glass. "That's a complicated story. One that might be difficult for you to believe." She shifted again, grimacing in pain. "But you deserve the truth, especially considering." She trailed off, her eyes moving to a framed photograph on the wall, Emma with her late husband John on the day they'd purchased Wild Winds Farm. "Considering what?" Emma prompted, a knot of apprehension forming in her stomach. Catherine met her gaze directly. "Considering your farm is at the center of something much bigger than a foreclosure notice from Heartland Agricultural Bank." Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. "How do you know about my foreclosure notice?" "Because that's why I'm here," Catherine replied, her voice strengthening despite her obvious physical discomfort. "Or more specifically, that's why I was on your property earlier today, before I got caught in the storm." And before Heartland's security team decided I was asking too many questions, Emma's eyes widened. Heartland's security team did this to you? It seemed implausible. The bank was aggressive in its collection practices, certainly, but physical violence? Not directly, Catherine clarified. They chased me off what they called bank-managed property, the Jenkins farm next door that they foreclosed on last month. When I wouldn't leave fast enough, they made it clear they were authorized to use force. I ran into the woods, lost my footing in the storm, and went down a ravine. She gestured to her injuries. This was the result. I was trying to find the main road when I saw your porch light. Emma processed this information slowly, but that doesn't explain why a White House advisor was investigating a local bank in the first place, or how you know about my financial situation. Catherine took a deep breath, wincing slightly at the pain it caused. Because Wild Winds Farm isn't just another foreclosure statistic, Ms. Hartwell. Your case file landed on my desk 3 weeks ago as part of a pattern that suggests Heartland Agricultural Bank isn't just foreclosing on family farms. They're systematically targeting them, manipulating loans, and potentially violating federal banking regulations to acquire specific properties. The knot in Emma's stomach tightened. She'd suspected something wasn't right about how quickly her loan terms had changed, how the bank had suddenly found compliance issues with her organic certification that had never been problems before, how every attempt to restructure her debt had been met with increasingly impossible terms. You're saying they want my farm specifically? Why? It's barely profitable. Catherine's expression was grim. It's not about the farm itself, but perhaps dozens of others. What happens now? That depends, Catherine said, her professional demeanor returning as she straightened slightly, despite the obvious pain it caused her. Originally, I planned to collect the evidence and return to Washington tonight, but considering my current condition and the storm, you're not going anywhere tonight, Emma said firmly, her natural practicality taking over. Those wounds need proper care. The roads are washed out. And from the looks of that ankle, you won't be hiking back to wherever you left your car. Catherine nodded, seemingly relieved at Emma's decisiveness. Then we have until morning to prepare, because once I make contact with my team and this evidence goes public, Heartland Bank will move quickly to cover their tracks. They have a team scheduled to visit your farm tomorrow. Emma felt her blood run cold. A team? What kind of team? According to their internal communications, they're sending representatives to perform a final compliance inspection before foreclosure proceedings. Catherine's expression darkened. What they're actually planning is to discover environmental violations they themselves will create, contaminated soil samples, fabricated water test results, anything to accelerate the seizure process before this evidence can be processed through official channels. Hey? Emma stood abruptly, pacing the worn carpet of her living room. They can't just show up and plant false evidence. I won't allow them on my property. Legally, they can inspect as part of your loan agreement, Catherine pointed out, and denying them access would only strengthen their case against you. So what? I just let them come and fabricate violations that could not only take my farm, but potentially result in fines I can't pay. Emma felt panic rising, the culmination of years of struggling against increasingly impossible odds. Catherine leaned forward, despite the pain it clearly caused her. No, we let them come, but we make sure they're not the only ones here when they do. The storm had subsided to a steady rain as Catherine explained her plan. Her team in Washington had been monitoring her investigation, expecting regular check-ins. When she missed her last scheduled contact, protocols would have been activated. By morning, they would be searching for her. I need to send a secure message as soon as possible, Catherine explained, taking a careful sip from the mug of tea Emma had prepared. Once they have my location and confirmation that I've found evidence, they'll move quickly. Emma eyed the ancient landline phone on her kitchen wall, her only connection to the outside world since she'd cancelled her cell phone service to save money. Will that work? For your secure message, I mean. Catherine shook her head. Too risky. The communication needs to be encrypted. She gestured to her hiking pack, which Emma had retrieved from the porch. There's a satellite phone in the side pocket. It has direct, secure access to my team. Emma retrieved the device, sleek, black, and far more sophisticated than anything she'd handled before. Catherine took it gratefully, powering it on and punching in a series of codes with practiced efficiency. The message she sent was brief, but Emma caught fragments. Evidence secured. Physical evidence of coordinated effort. Medical attention required. Wild Winds Farm, Madison County. Presidential authority requested. Presidential authority, Emma echoed as Catherine set the device aside. Isn't that a bit excessive for a banking fraud case? Catherine's expression was grim but determined. This isn't just fraud, Ms. Hartwell. This is about control of natural resources, a systematic effort to monopolize water supplies across multiple states. The president has been briefed on this investigation from the beginning. The implications slowly sank in. Emma had been so focused on her personal struggle, the fight to keep her farm, to honor her husband's memory, to maintain her family legacy, that she'd missed the bigger picture. Her small corner of rural America was a battleground in a much larger conflict. Will they come? Emma asked quietly. Your team, I mean. Will they get here before Heartland's people tomorrow? Catherine's confidence didn't waver. They'll come. The question is whether Heartland will accelerate their timeline once they realize I've disappeared with their data. We should prepare for either possibility. Through the remainder of the night, as the storm gradually subsided to a gentle patter of rain, Emma and Catherine worked methodically. First, they consolidated their evidence, Catherine's downloaded files, and Emma's documentation of the bank's pattern of harassment. Years of meticulous record-keeping, a habit John had instilled in her, now proved invaluable. Email chains showing suddenly changed loan terms, inspection reports that contradicted each other, water testing results that mysteriously worsened after Heartland took over the testing protocol. You've been fighting them longer than you realized, Catherine observed as they spread the documentation across Emma's dining table. Most people would have given up months ago. Emma thought of John, of his unwavering belief in their dream of an organic farm that worked in harmony with the land rather than exploiting it. This isn't just land to me, she said simply. It's a promise I made. As the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 3 in the morning, they moved on to securing the property as best they could. Catherine, despite her injuries, insisted on helping Emma check vulnerable entry points and establish a perimeter they could monitor. The question of whether Heartland might take more aggressive action than just a fraudulent inspection remained, unspoken but acknowledged in their preparations. By the time the eastern sky showed the first hints of dawn, a faint lightening of the cloud-covered horizon, they had done all they could. Emma insisted that Catherine rest, helping her back to the sofa, where she could elevate her injured ankle. You should sleep too, Catherine said, noting the exhaustion evident in Emma's face. Emma shook her head. I'll keep watch. Farm habits die hard. I'm used to early mornings. The truth was, sleep felt impossible with so much uncertainty ahead. Instead, Emma settled into the rocker by the living room window, Rusty curled at her feet, watching the farm gradually emerge from darkness. The storm had left its mark, branches down, fields waterlogged, the gravel driveway partly washed out. But the old farmhouse had weathered another tempest, as it had for over a century. The familiar morning ritual of watching her land awaken brought a sense of calm that had been missing in the chaos of the night. This was why she had fought so hard for so long, not just for ownership of acres and buildings, but for this perspective, this harmony with the rhythms of the natural world that industrial agriculture had forgotten. The peace was shattered by the distant sound of vehicles approaching. Emma tensed, checking her watch. Just past 6 in the morning, too early for Heartland's inspection team, according to Catherine's intelligence. She peered through the rain-streaked window, trying to identify the approaching vehicles. "They're here," she called softly to Catherine, who immediately struggled to a sitting position. "Heartland?" Catherine asked, reaching for the satellite phone. Emma shook her head, a mixture of confusion and alarm rising as she made out the distinct shapes of the approaching convoy. "No, those are government vehicles, black SUVs, at least 4 of them." Catherine relaxed visibly, relief washing over her pale features. "My team. They moved faster than I expected." But as the vehicles drew closer, turning into Emma's long driveway with practiced precision, even Catherine's expression shifted to surprise. These weren't ordinary government SUVs. The distinctive markings and formations were unmistakable to anyone who had ever watched a news broadcast. "That's not just your team," Emma said slowly, watching as the vehicles formed a protective pattern around one central SUV. "That's a presidential motorcade." Catherine struggled to her feet, moving to join Emma at the window despite her injuries. "That's impossible," she murmured, though the evidence was rolling up Emma's driveway. "The president is supposed to be in Chicago today for an economic summit." Emma turned to her, questions forming, but before she could voice them, the satellite, the phone on the coffee table, chirped. Catherine retrieved it quickly, listening to the message with an expression that shifted from confusion to astonishment. "Confirmed," she said into the device. "We'll be ready." She turned to Emma, her professional composure momentarily cracked by genuine shock. "The president diverted from his schedule. He's coming here, to your farm." Emma felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath her. "The President of the United States is coming to Wild Wind's farm. Now, like this." She gestured helplessly at herself, still wearing yesterday's work clothes, her hair hastily tied back, her home modest and showing the signs of financial struggle. Catherine's professional demeanor returned as she straightened, wincing slightly at her injuries. "This investigation has been a personal priority for the President. When my team reported I'd found conclusive evidence but was injured, he apparently decided to see the situation firsthand." She paused, adding with a hint of dry humor, "He has a knack for dramatic timing." Emma had no time to process this information as the motorcade came to a stop in her front yard. Secret Service agents emerged first, quickly establishing a perimeter around the vehicles. One approached the farmhouse directly, his bearing formal but not threatening. "Miss Hartwell," he called from the bottom of the porch steps. "I'm Agent Collins with the United States Secret Service. We need to secure your property for a presidential visit. May we come in?" The surreal quality of the moment wasn't lost on Emma as she opened her front door. "Yes, of course," she managed, stepping aside as the agent and 2 colleagues entered, their practiced eyes scanning every corner of her modest home. They acknowledged Catherine with evident relief. "Ms. Morgan, we've been concerned. For your safety, medical personnel are standing by." Catherine nodded. "Thank you, Agent Collins. I've received excellent care from Ms. Hartwell, but I would appreciate a medical evaluation before briefing the President." The well-oiled machine of presidential security moved with impressive efficiency. Within minutes, Emma's farmhouse had been secured. Catherine had been examined by a medical officer from the motorcade, and word was passed that the property was ready for the president's arrival. Emma watched in disbelief as the door to the central SUV opened and the President of the United States stepped onto the muddy driveway of Wild Wind's farm. In person, he seemed both exactly as he appeared on television and somehow more human, his face showing the fatigue of office, but his eyes alert and observant as he took in the farmhouse, the fields beyond, and finally Emma herself standing on her porch. "Miss Hartwell," he said as he approached, his voice carrying easily across the short distance, "I understand you've had quite a night." Emma felt strangely calm as she responded, the absurdity of the situation somehow lending her courage. "Less eventful than yours, I imagine, Mr. President. It's not every day the leader of the free world diverts to a struggling farm in Madison County." His laugh was genuine as he climbed the porch steps, extending his hand. "Some situations deserve personal attention. Catherine Morgan is one of my most valued advisors. When I heard she was injured while investigating a matter I consider of national importance, and that a local farmer had potentially saved her life." He paused, his expression turning more serious. "Well, I wanted to thank you myself." Emma accepted his handshake, finding his grip firm and direct. She would have done the same for any stranger in need. The president nodded, then glanced toward the door. "May we continue this conversation inside? I understand there's evidence I need to see." The next hour passed in a blur of activity that transformed Emma's kitchen into an impromptu situation room. The president sat at her worn oak table, where, just hours before, she had been despairing over foreclosure notices, now reviewing the evidence Catherine had gathered. Additional staff had arrived, setting up secure communications equipment. Outside, more vehicles had appeared, including what Emma recognized as FBI and Department of Justice transport. "The pattern is undeniable," the president said, looking up from the documents spread before him. His expression had hardened as he'd reviewed the evidence, the politician's charm replaced by cold anger. "This isn't just predatory lending. This is a coordinated attempt to control natural resources through manipulating federal banking regulations." Catherine, now properly bandaged by the medical officer but refusing evacuation until the briefing was complete, nodded. "The aquifer under Ms. Hartwell's farm is just one target. We've identified similar patterns in 7 other states, all focusing on water resources." The president turned to Emma, who had been quietly observing from the periphery of her own kitchen, still struggling to process the transformation of her home into the center of what was clearly becoming a major federal investigation. "Ms. Hartwell, I owe you an apology," he said, his tone sincere. "This happened on my watch. The regulations that should have protected your farm and others like it were circumvented because we weren't paying close enough attention to how corporate interests were consolidating control of natural resources." Emma was taken aback by the direct acknowledgement. "With all due respect, Mr. President, apologies won't save my farm or the others that have already been lost." Rather than taking offense, he nodded in agreement. "You're absolutely right, which is why I didn't just come here to thank you for helping Ms. Morgan." He gestured to one of his aides, who approached with a leather folder. "I came to take immediate action." He accepted the folder and extracted an official document bearing the presidential seal. "This is an executive order freezing all foreclosure proceedings by Heartland Agricultural Bank and its affiliates, pending a full federal investigation, effective immediately." Emma stared at the document, trying to comprehend its implications. "You can do that? Just stop them?" "In cases where there's evidence of fraud involving federally regulated banks? Yes." His expression was grim but determined. "It's a temporary measure while the Justice Department builds its case, but it should give you and others in your situation some breathing room." The practical farmer in Emma couldn't help but see the limitations. That's a start, but many of us are genuinely struggling financially, even without the bank's manipulation. A pause in foreclosure doesn't address the underlying economic challenges of small-scale farming. The president's respect seemed to deepen at her candor. "Which brings me to the second purpose of my visit. He nodded to another aide, who stepped forward with a different folder. "We're announcing a new rural sustainability initiative today. Federal support for small farms, transitioning to organic and sustainable practices, with special focus on water conservation and protection of natural water resources." Emma accepted the folder with cautious hope, quickly scanning the documents inside. The program outlined was comprehensive. Financial support, technical assistance, marketing help, and legal resources specifically for small-scale farmers committed to sustainable practices. "This isn't a handout," the president clarified, seeming to read her thoughts. "It's an investment in our nation's food security and natural resources. And we'd like Wild Winds Farm to be one of our first partner operations." The implications slowly sank in. Not just a reprieve from foreclosure, but actual support to make her vision for the farm economically viable. The validation of everything she and John had believed about the importance of sustainable agriculture. "Why me?" she asked finally. "There are thousands of struggling small farms across the country." The president gestured toward Catherine, who, despite her injuries, sat with perfect posture at Emma's kitchen table. "Ms. Morgan didn't choose your farm at random. Your operation was identified in our preliminary research as a model of what sustainable agriculture could look like in this region. Your methods of water conservation, soil management, and organic practices are exactly what we want to encourage." He paused, his expression becoming more personal. "And then there's the matter of your character. Not everyone would open their door to a stranger in a storm, much less provide medical care and protection, when they discovered that stranger was investigating powerful interests threatening their livelihood." Emma felt a flush of pride mixed with lingering disbelief. For years, she had felt like she was shouting into the void about sustainable farming practices while watching industrial operations receive all the support and attention. Now, the most powerful person in the country was sitting at her kitchen table, validating everything she had fought for. Before she could formulate a response, there was a commotion outside. Through the window, Emma saw new vehicles arriving. Not government vehicles, but 3 black sedans with tinted windows and corporate plates. The men emerging from them wore expensive suits, incongruous with the muddy farm setting, their expressions shifting from determination to confusion as they registered the presidential motorcade occupying the driveway. "Right on schedule," Catherine observed, checking her watch. "Heartland's inspection team arriving to plant their evidence. They seem to have brought reinforcements." The president's security detail had already moved to intercept the newcomers, creating a perimeter that kept them at the edge of the property. One of the Secret Service agents entered the kitchen, addressing the president in lowered tones. "Sir, we have representatives from Heartland Agricultural Bank requesting access to the property. They claim to have a scheduled inspection under the terms of Ms. Hartwell's loan agreement." The president exchanged a look with Catherine before turning to Emma. "Ms. Hartwell, it's your property. How would you like to handle this?" Emma felt a surge of something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Power. Not power over others, but agency in her own life, control over her own circumstances. For years, she had been at the mercy of forces that seemed too large to fight. Now, those forces were quite literally being held at the edge of her property, awaiting her decision. "I think," she said slowly, "that I'd like to hear what they have to say, with witnesses present." The president nodded, respect evident in his expression. "A direct approach. I appreciate that." He turned to the Secret Service agent. "Please inform the bank representatives that Ms. Hartwell will meet with them on the front porch in 5 minutes. They may bring 2 representatives, no more." As the agent departed to deliver the message, the president turned back to Emma. "You don't have to do this now. The executive order already protects your property." Emma straightened her shoulders. With all due respect, Mr. President, I've been fighting this battle alone for 3 years. I'd like to see it through. Catherine began gathering the evidence they'd spread across the kitchen table. We should document this encounter. If they're carrying falsified samples or testing equipment, it becomes additional evidence for the Justice Department. The activity in the farmhouse took on a new energy as preparations were made. Emma took a moment to go to her bedroom, changing from her rumpled clothes into a clean flannel shirt and jeans, still work clothes, but freshly laundered. She pulled her hair back neatly and looked at herself in the mirror. The face that looked back at her was tired but determined. The face of a woman who had endured more than most and was still standing. When she returned to the kitchen, the president had moved to the living room with his aides, allowing Catherine to brief him further on the investigation while giving Emma space to prepare. The medical officer who had treated Catherine approached Emma quietly. Ms. Morgan refused evacuation, but she really should be in a hospital, he said in low tones. That gash on her side needs proper stitches, and I'm concerned about possible internal injuries. Emma nodded. I'll make sure she gets proper care once this immediate situation is resolved. She's tougher than she looks. The officer smiled slightly. So, I've observed. You both are. At exactly the 5-minute mark, Emma stepped onto her front porch, flanked by Catherine and a Justice Department official who had been quietly introduced as the lead prosecutor for financial crimes. The president remained inside, watching. Through the window, his presence known to the bank representatives, but deliberately not part of this confrontation. The two men who approached from the bank sedans could not have looked more out of place on a working farm. Their expensive suits and polished shoes were already showing signs of distress from the muddy ground. Emma recognized the older of the two as Charles Westfield, Heartland Agricultural Bank's regional vice president. The younger man was unfamiliar, but his bearing suggested legal counsel. Ms. Hartwell, Westfield began, his practiced smile faltering slightly as he registered Catherine's presence and the official beside her. We're here for the scheduled compliance inspection as outlined in Section 7B of your loan agreement. I don't believe we've had the pleasure, he added, glancing at Catherine with poorly concealed concern. Catherine Morgan, Presidential Environmental Policy Advisor, Catherine replied coolly, not extending her hand. And this is Assistant Attorney General Marcus Reynolds, Department of Justice. The blood drained from Westfield's face so quickly that Emma might have been concerned for his health under different circumstances. The lawyer beside him stiffened, his hand tightening on the briefcase he carried. I see, Westfield managed, visibly struggling to process this development. Perhaps there's been some miscommunication. Our visit today is a routine matter between the bank and Ms. Hartwell. Is it routine to bring falsified soil samples and manipulated water testing equipment to plant on a client's property? Emma asked, her voice steady despite the anger she felt remembering all the sleepless nights, all the tears shed at her kitchen table as she struggled to meet the bank's ever-changing demands. Westfield's composure cracked further. That's a serious accusation, Ms. Hartwell, one that could be considered defamatory. The Justice Department official stepped forward slightly. It would be defamatory if it weren't supported by extensive evidence, Mr. Westfield, including internal emails from your corporate offices discussing this very visit and its actual purpose. I don't know what you think you have. Westfield began, but the lawyer beside him placed a warning hand on his arm. Perhaps, the lawyer interjected smoothly, this inspection could be rescheduled when there's less confusion about its purpose. Emma felt a surge of righteous anger. There's no confusion, Counselor. For 3 years, Your client has been systematically manipulating my loan terms, falsifying inspection reports, and creating artificial compliance issues, all to force me into foreclosure so Heartland could acquire my property for its water rights. She stepped forward, closing the distance between herself and the men who had nearly destroyed everything she loved. But that ends today. Catherine produced a document from the folder she carried. This is a copy of an executive order signed this morning, freezing all foreclosure proceedings by Heartland Agricultural Bank, pending a federal investigation into predatory lending practices, banking fraud, and conspiracy to monopolize natural resources. She handed the document to the stunned lawyer, who scanned it with increasing alarm. Westfield peered over his shoulder, his face shifting from shock to calculation. Even if such an investigation were to proceed, Westfield said carefully, recovering some of his professional demeanor, proving intentional fraud rather than standard business practices would be extremely difficult. The assistant attorney general smiled thinly. Under normal circumstances, perhaps. But circumstances changed significantly last night when Miss Morgan downloaded your entire internal server, including board meeting minutes discussing the aquifer beneath Ms. Hartwell's property, coordinated plans to manipulate loan terms for targeted acquisitions, and communications with your parent company about developing these water resources once the properties were secured. The lawyer closed his eyes briefly, the implications clearly not lost on him. Westfield, however, seemed determined to maintain control of the situation. These are serious allegations that will need to be addressed through proper legal channels, he said stiffly. In the meantime, as Ms. Hartwell's loan is still in default regardless of any foreclosure freeze— Actually, Emma interrupted, a sense of satisfaction warming her despite the chilly morning air. My loan is no longer in default. She produced a document from her pocket, one that had been prepared during the whirlwind of activity in her kitchen. This is confirmation that Wild Winds Farm has been enrolled in the new Rural Sustainability Initiative, with an immediate grant specifically designated for refinancing predatory agricultural loans through the Federal Land Bank. Westfield took the document, his hands not quite steady. This program doesn't even exist. This can't be legally binding. Check the signature, Catherine suggested mildly. The banker's eyes widened as he registered the presidential signature at the bottom of the page. At that moment, as if choreographed, the front door of the farmhouse opened and the President of the United States stepped onto the porch. The transformation in the bankers was immediate and almost comical. Westfield's posture went ramrod straight, while the lawyer seemed to be fighting the instinct to bow. "Mr. President," Westfield stammered, "we had no idea you were— This is an unprecedented—" "Good morning, gentlemen," the President said, his tone pleasant, but with an underlying steel that silenced Westfield instantly. "I understand you're here to inspect Ms. Hartwell's farm for compliance issues." "We were just explaining that may not be necessary at this time," the lawyer interjected quickly. "Actually," the President continued as if he hadn't heard, "I've been conducting my own inspection this morning. I've found Ms. Hartwell's operation to be an exemplary model of sustainable agriculture. So much so that I've designated Wild Winds Farm as a demonstration site for the new Rural Sustainability Initiative we're announcing today." He moved to stand beside Emma, the symbolism of the moment not lost on anyone present. Ms. Hartwell embodies exactly the kind of responsible stewardship of natural resources that this administration intends to support, the kind of stewardship that stands in stark contrast to corporate attempts to monopolize those same resources through manipulative and potentially illegal means. Westfield had gone pale again, but the banker in him made one last attempt. "Mr. President, while we respect your authority, banking regulations and private contracts are subject to federal oversight, particularly when there's evidence of fraud." the Assistant Attorney General finished for him. "Mr. Westfield, I suggest you return to your office and prepare for a comprehensive audit. Federal agents are already securing Heartland's records as we speak." As if to confirm his words, the sound of approaching helicopters became audible, growing louder as two black FBI choppers appeared over the tree line, heading toward the direction of the Heartland Agricultural Bank's regional headquarters 20 miles away. The lawyer touched Westfield's arm again, this time more urgently. "Charles, we should go, now!" The banker seemed to finally grasp the gravity of his situation. With a stiff nod that barely qualified as courtesy, he turned and walked rapidly back to the waiting sedans, his lawyer hurrying to keep pace. As they drove away, Emma felt something she had almost forgotten. The lightness that comes with the lifting of a burden carried too long. She turned to find the president watching her with an expression of genuine respect. "That," he said quietly, "was well done, Ms. Hartwell." Emma felt her exhaustion catching up with her as the adrenaline of confrontation faded. "Thank you, Mr. President, for all of this." She gestured vaguely at the farm around them, at the future that had been nearly lost and was now secured. "Don't thank me yet," he replied with a wry smile. "The announcement we're making today from your farm is going to make you a very public figure in the sustainable agriculture movement. The press will be arriving within the hour." Emma glanced down at her simple clothes, at the mud still caking her work boots. "I'm not exactly dressed for a national press conference." Catherine, who had been quietly observing the exchange, stepped forward. "You're dressed exactly right. You're a working farmer who's just helped uncover a major conspiracy. Authenticity matters more than polished appearances." The president nodded in agreement. "Ms. Morgan is right. Your story and this farm are powerful symbols of what we're trying to protect." He paused, considering her thoughtfully. "But only if you're willing. This is still your property, Ms. Hartwell. Your life. We can make the announcement elsewhere if you prefer to stay out of the spotlight." Emma looked out over her land. The field still glistening with raindrops in the morning sun, the orchard her grandfather had planted, the creek that meandered along the eastern boundary, all of it sitting above an aquifer that powerful interests had been willing to manipulate federal banking regulations to acquire. "This was never just about saving my farm," she said finally. "It was about what's right, about protecting something valuable for future generations." She turned back to the president, her decision made. "If sharing my story helps protect other farms and natural resources, then I'm ready for those cameras." The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Government vehicles continued to arrive, transforming Emma's modest farm into something resembling a command center. Communications equipment was set up, security perimeters established, and a small podium appeared on her front porch, hastily constructed but bearing the presidential seal. Catherine, despite repeated urgings from the medical officer, refused evacuation until after the press conference. "I started this investigation," she told Emma as they watched the preparations from the kitchen window. "I want to see it through." But she had compromised by allowing an IV for fluids and pain medication, making her injuries somewhat more bearable. By mid-morning, the muddy farm lane was lined with news vans. Reporters who had been covering the president's economic summit in Chicago had been diverted with promises of a major announcement, though the exact nature of that announcement remained under tight control. Emma used the brief respite before the press conference to call her closest neighbors, the few remaining independent farmers in the valley who hadn't yet succumbed to Heartland's tactics. The calls were brief but emotional, as she explained, the morning's events and the implications for their own struggling operations. "You should come," she told Martha Jenkins, whose dairy farm adjoined her property to the north. "This affects all of us." "We're already on our way," Martha replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Half the valley is. word spreading fast. Indeed, by the time Emma emerged from her house to join the president for the press conference, she was amazed to see the crowd that had gathered beyond the security perimeter. Farmers in work clothes and muddy boots stood shoulder to shoulder with local townspeople. News cameras were positioned to capture both the official announcement and the community reaction. The president had taken a few moments to freshen up. In Emma's spare bedroom, emerging looking slightly less travel-worn, but maintaining the purposeful energy that had characterized his unexpected visit. As they prepared to step onto the porch, now transformed into an impromptu stage, he turned to Emma. "Agricultural policy doesn't usually make headlines," he said with a rueful smile. "But what we're announcing today isn't just about farming. It's about who controls the resources all life depends on, and whether we'll allow those resources to be monopolized for profit at the expense of rural communities." Emma nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. "My husband used to say that water would be the new oil, that someday people would recognize its true value above all other resources." "Your husband was ahead of his time," the president replied. "I wish I could have met him." "So do I," Emma said softly as they stepped into the sunlight. The camera flashes were immediate and disorienting. Emma had never experienced anything like the focused attention of the National Press Corps, their shouted questions overlapping into an incomprehensible wave of sound. But the president moved with practiced ease to the podium, his presence immediately commanding silence. "Good morning," he began, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "Today, I'm speaking to you from Wild Winds Farm in Madison County, where we're announcing a new chapter in America's approach to sustainable agriculture and the protection of our most precious natural resources." As he outlined the Rural Sustainability Initiative, its funding mechanisms, its focus on small farms transitioning to organic and sustainable practices, its emphasis on water conservation, Emma watched the faces in the crowd. She saw skepticism transform into cautious hope, saw tears on the weathered cheeks of farmers who had been fighting the same battles she had, saw the dawning recognition that something fundamental was shifting. "But this initiative is only half of today's announcement," the president continued, his tone turning more serious. "Last night, as a result of an ongoing investigation led by my environmental policy team, we uncovered evidence of a coordinated effort by certain financial institutions to manipulate agricultural loans for the purpose of acquiring land with valuable water resources." The press corps erupted at this, shouted questions demanding details, clarifications, names. The president raised a hand for silence. "The Justice Department has launched a full investigation, and I have signed an executive order freezing all foreclosure proceedings by the institutions involved, pending the results of that investigation," the president continued firmly. "But we aren't just addressing the symptoms of a broken system. Today, we're also announcing the Clean Water Security Act, new legislation to prevent monopolization of groundwater resources and protect agricultural communities from predatory acquisition practices." The crowd erupted in applause, particularly from the assembled farmers who understood better than most what this announcement meant. Emma felt a surge of emotion as she saw Martha Jenkins openly weeping, her husband's arm around her shoulders. The Jenkins family had been on the verge of losing their dairy operation, the fourth generation to work that land, to the same tactics Heartland had used against Emma. "I want to be clear," the president said as the applause subsided. "This isn't about government overreach into private enterprise. This is about ensuring that our natural resources, particularly freshwater, which all life depends on, remains accessible to local communities rather than monopolized by corporate interests. It's about recognizing that family farms aren't just businesses, they're stewards of our national heritage and guardians of our food security." He turned slightly, gesturing toward Emma. And that brings me to the final part of today's announcement. None of this would have been possible without the courage and integrity of one person who stands beside me today. Ms. Emma Hartwell, owner of Wild Winds Farm, who last night opened her door to a stranger in need, and in doing so, helped uncover a conspiracy that threatened rural communities across this nation. Emma had not expected to be called forward, had not prepared any remarks. But as the president stepped back from the podium, making space for her to speak, she found herself moving forward, drawn by some deeper sense of responsibility that transcended her personal shyness. The cameras were intimidating, the sea of faces, both familiar and foreign, overwhelming. But when Emma spoke, she found her voice steady, grounded in the same certainty that had kept her fighting for her farm through years of struggle. "I'm not a politician or a public speaker," she began, her hands gripping the edges of the podium. "I'm just a farmer who believes in working with the land, not against it. For years, I fought to keep this farm because it represents something bigger than myself, a way of life that respects natural cycles and preserves resources for future generations." She paused, looking out over the crowd to where her neighbors stood, their expressions reflecting back the shared struggle they had all endured. Many of us here have felt powerless against forces that seem too big to fight. Banks that changed the rules mid-game, corporations that valued profit over community, systems that seemed designed to eliminate small farms rather than support them. Today marks a turning point, not just for Wild Winds Farm, but for all of us who believe that how we grow our food matters, that water is a resource too precious to be controlled by the highest bidder, and that rural communities deserve to thrive. The words came naturally, rising from years of quiet conviction that had sustained her through her darkest moments. As she continued, Emma felt a weight lifting, the burden of isolation that had made her struggles so much harder to bear. "When I opened my door last night to someone in need, I wasn't thinking about politics or investigations. I was doing what any of us would do for a neighbor. That simple act of humanity led to this moment, not because I'm special, but because it connected me to people who were fighting the same battle from a different angle." She turned slightly, acknowledging Catherine, who stood to the side of the porch, still pale from her injuries, but radiating quiet satisfaction as the investigation she had championed reached its public culmination. This initiative the president has announced today isn't just about saving farms like mine. It's about recognizing that sustainable agriculture is national security, that clean water is a right, not a privilege, and that the strength of America has always rested in communities like ours, people who care for the land and for each other. The applause that followed her words seemed to roll across the farmyard in waves, building rather than diminishing as farmers raised their hands in solidarity and reporters turned their cameras to capture the community's reaction. Emma stepped back from the podium, suddenly conscious of having spoken from her heart without filtering her thoughts through any political lens. The president returned to her side, genuine respect evident in his expression. "Thank you, Ms. Hartwell," he said, his voice amplified by the microphones, but carrying a personal sincerity that transcended the formal setting. "For your words, and more importantly, for your example." He turned back to address the press corps, now opening the floor to questions. The first came immediately, a national correspondent stepping forward. "Mr. President, can you name the financial institutions involved in this alleged conspiracy, and will there be criminal charges?" The president gestured to the Justice Department official, who stepped forward to address the specifics. Heartland Agricultural Bank is the primary institution under investigation, along with its parent company Midwest Financial Group and their corporate partner Global Resource Partners. The investigation is in its early stages, but based on the evidence secured last night, we anticipate multiple charges, including banking fraud, conspiracy, and violations of federal anti-monopoly regulations. Another reporter called out, "Ms. Hartwell, did you know who Catherine Morgan was when you helped her last night?" Emma shook her head, stepping back to the microphone. "I had no idea. I just saw someone injured who needed help. Anyone would have done the same." "Not everyone would have," Catherine interjected, moving forward despite her obvious discomfort. "Ms. Hartwell took me in when I was a stranger, treated my injuries, and then stood by me when she discovered I was investigating the very bank threatening her livelihood. That kind of moral courage is rare and should be recognized." The questions continued, becoming more technical as reporters sought details on the Rural Sustainability Initiative, the proposed legislation, and the scope of the federal investigation. Throughout, Emma remained beside the president, occasionally answering questions specific to her experience, but mostly observing as policy experts and justice officials elaborated on how the morning's announcements would translate into concrete changes for farming communities. As the formal press conference concluded, the president turned to Emma, speaking quietly, now that the microphones were no longer capturing every word. "You did well. Better than most seasoned politicians I know." Emma smiled, fatigue and exhilaration competing as the adrenaline of the moment began to fade. "I just spoke the truth, as I see it." "That's rarer than you might think in Washington," he replied with a wry smile. He gestured toward the farmyard, where reporters were now mingling with local farmers, capturing the community's reactions to the morning's events. "Your farm is going to be the center of a lot of attention for a while. Are you ready for that?" Emma looked out over her land. The fields she had worked with her own hands, the orchard her grandfather had planted, the creek that fed the aquifer now protected from corporate acquisition. She thought of John, who had believed in their vision of sustainable agriculture when most people thought they were idealistic fools. What would he have made of all this? "I think," she said slowly, "that if the attention helps other farms like mine survive, then it's worth whatever disruption it brings." The president nodded, understanding in his eyes. "The Rural Sustainability Initiative team will be in touch within the week to begin the process of enrolling Wild Winds Farm as a demonstration site. In the meantime, if there's anything you need—" "Actually," Emma interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness, "there is one thing. The Jenkins family farm next door was scheduled for auction next week. They've been fighting the same battle I have, with the same bank. Can your executive order help them too?" The president turned to confer briefly with his advisors, then nodded to Emma. "All Heartland foreclosure proceedings are frozen, effective immediately, but I'll make sure the Jenkins case receives specific attention from our task force." Relief flooded through Emma. It wasn't just her farm that mattered. It was the entire community of independent farmers that Heartland had targeted. Saving one operation while others failed would be a hollow victory. As the presidential entourage prepared to depart, Catherine approached Emma one last time. The presidential physician had finally convinced her to accept medical evacuation to a proper hospital, but she had insisted on saying goodbye first. "This isn't the end," Catherine said, her professional demeanor softened by genuine warmth. "It's just the beginning of a new chapter for Wild Winds Farm. My team will be in regular contact as the investigation proceeds. We'll need your testimony and documentation as the case develops." Emma nodded, feeling a strange mixture of gratitude and protectiveness toward this woman who had literally stumbled into her life less than 24 hours ago. "You need to focus on recovering first. Those injuries aren't minor." Catherine smiled, acknowledging the truth with a slight wince. "I've been ordered to take medical leave for at least 2 weeks. But after that, I'll be back to see how the demonstration site is developing." She paused, adding more quietly, "And to thank you properly for saving my life." "You saved my farm," Emma replied simply. "I'd say we're even." As Catherine was helped toward the medical transport, Emma turned to find her neighbors approaching, Martha and Frank Jenkins, followed by several other local farmers who had come to witness the historic announcement. Their expressions held a mixture of hope and lingering disbelief, as if they were still processing the morning's sudden reversal of fortune. "Is it really true?" Martha asked, her voice trembling slightly. "About the foreclosures being stopped?" Emma nodded, reaching out to grasp Martha's work-roughened hand. "Yes, and there's more. The president is making sure your case gets special attention from the task force." Frank Jenkins, a man known for his stoic nature, wiped moisture from his eyes without shame. "We were packing the last of our things," he said gruffly. "The auctioneer was coming Monday." "Not anymore," Emma assured him. "And once you're enrolled in the new Rural Sustainability Initiative, there will be resources to refinance through the Federal Land Bank at fair terms." The circle of farmers tightened around Emma, questions flowing faster than she could answer. Them. What exactly did the new program cover? How soon could they apply? What would happen to Heartland Bank now? Emma shared what she knew, promising to keep them informed as she learned more details. As the presidential motorcade departed with Catherine safely aboard the medical transport, the farm gradually returned to a semblance of normalcy. The press corps dispersed to file their stories. Government officials departed to begin implementing the morning's announcements, and eventually only Emma's neighbors remained, gathered in her kitchen where the unlikely chain of events had begun. Martha insisted on cooking, replenishing the soup pot Emma had used to feed Catherine the night before. Other neighbors brought whatever they had: fresh bread, preserves, a bottle of homemade wine, transforming the gathering into an impromptu celebration of their collective reprieve. "I still can't believe it," old Henry Davidson said, shaking his head as they sat around Emma's kitchen table. At 82, he was the oldest farmer still working in the valley, his family's heritage orchard dating back to the 1880s. The president himself, standing on your porch, announcing a policy that might actually help small farms instead of industrial operations. "It's not just the policy," Frank Jenkins added, his earlier emotion now contained but still evident in his intent expression. "It's the recognition that what happened to us wasn't just bad luck or changing markets. It was deliberate. They were targeting our land for the water beneath it all along." Emma nodded, understanding completely. For years, she and her neighbors had blamed themselves for their struggles, wondering if they were simply inadequate business managers, if their commitment to sustainable methods was economically naive, if they were foolish to resist progress in the form of industrial-scale agriculture. The confirmation that external forces had been actively working against them was both infuriating and strangely liberating. "The question now," Emma said, looking around at the weathered faces that represented generations of agricultural heritage, "is what we do with this opportunity. The investigation will address the wrongdoing, and the executive order buys us time. But the Rural Sustainability Initiative is about building something new, something better than what we had before." Martha leaned forward, the practical dairy farmer in her already thinking ahead. "We need to coordinate. If Wild Winds is going to be a demonstration site, we should align our operations to complement each other. Henry's heritage apple varieties, our dairy operation, your organic vegetables. Together we could create a model of diversified, sustainable agriculture for the region." The conversation flowed late into the afternoon, evolving from shocked relief to tentative planning for a future none of them had dared imagine 24 hours earlier. By the time her neighbors departed, hugging Emma with uncharacteristic, emotional openness, The first outline of a cooperative approach had emerged, one that would strengthen all their operations while preserving their independence. As the sun began to set, Emma finally found herself alone in the quiet farmhouse that had been the center of so much activity. Rusty, who had been banished to the back porch during the formal proceedings, now reclaimed his place by her side as she walked the property in the fading light. The farm looked different somehow. The same fields, the same buildings, the same challenges of work to be done, but infused with new possibility. Emma stopped at the eastern fence line, where her property adjoined what had been the Jenkins farm and would now remain so. From this vantage point, she could see the subtle signs of the aquifer's presence, the particular lushness of certain areas, the pattern of mist that formed in low spots on cool mornings. Water, so fundamental to life that people took it for granted until it was threatened. Emma thought of how many civilizations had risen and fallen based on their relationship to this essential resource. The corporate interests that had targeted her community had recognized water's true value long before most politicians or citizens had understood that controlling water meant controlling everything that depended on it. As darkness fell, Emma returned to the house, her mind still processing the day's events, but her body demanding rest after the sleepless night and emotionally charged day. She paused at the bottom of the porch steps, looking back at her land, now silvered by the rising moon. For the first time in years, she would sleep without the crushing weight of impending loss pressing down on her. Wild Wind's farm was secure, not just temporarily, but with a path forward that honored everything she and John had believed about working in harmony with the land. Inside, the farmhouse still bore evidence of its brief transformation into a center of national policy announcements. The furniture slightly rearranged, coffee cups left behind by government staffers, boot prints on her formerly clean floor. Emma moved through the rooms, slowly, restoring order, reclaiming her space. In the living room where Catherine had spent the night, Emma found a small envelope propped against a lamp. Inside was a handwritten note on official stationery. Emma, when I began this investigation, I was focused on policies and regulations, on corporate malfeasance and environmental justice. Last night reminded me that behind every policy issue are real people with the courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult. Thank you for reminding me why this work matters. Wild Winds Farm won't just be a demonstration site for sustainable agriculture. It will be a symbol of what happens when good people stand firm against powerful interests that would sacrifice community for profit. I'm honored to have played a small role in preserving your legacy. With deepest gratitude, Catherine. Beneath the signature was a personal cell phone number and a request to stay in touch as both the investigation and the Rural Sustainability Initiative developed. Emma set the note aside, touched by its sincerity but too exhausted to fully process its implications. She completed her evening chores on autopilot, checking that the chickens were secure, that the greenhouse vents were properly set, that the perimeter fencing was intact. The routines that had sustained her through years of uncertainty now felt like affirmations rather than obligations. As she finally prepared for sleep, her phone rang, an unusual occurrence this late in the evening. The number was unfamiliar, but Emma answered anyway, half expecting it to be another reporter seeking comment on the day's events. Instead, she heard Martha Jenkins' voice, thick with emotion. Emma, I had to call. We just got official confirmation from the Justice Department. The auction of our farm has been cancelled. Not just postponed, cancelled entirely. They're reviewing our loan under the new guidelines, and in the meantime, we keep operating as normal. That's wonderful news, Emma said. Genuine happiness. For her neighbors temporarily overriding her fatigue. It's more than that, Martha continued. Frank just heard from the Williamsons and the Garcias. They got the same notification. Every farm in foreclosure with heartland in this county has been pulled back from the brink. She paused, her voice breaking slightly. "You didn't just save your farm, Emma. You saved all of us." After the call ended, Emma stood by her bedroom window, looking out at the moonlit landscape of Wild Wind's farm. The weight of Martha's words settled on her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a responsibility she found herself ready to accept. One act of kindness on a stormy night had rippled outward in ways she could never have anticipated. Connecting her small farm to national policy, her personal struggle to a broader movement for justice. Emma had never sought to be a symbol or a catalyst, had never imagined her quiet resistance becoming the cornerstone of systemic change. Yet somehow, that was exactly what had happened. As she finally slipped into bed, emotionally and physically drained, Emma thought of John, what he would have made of this extraordinary day. How his face would have lit up with vindication after years of people dismissing their vision as impractical idealism. Before sleep claimed her, she whispered into the darkness, "We did it, love. We saved the farm." The morning brought a different kind of chaos than the previous day. Emma's phone began ringing at dawn. More news outlets seeking interviews, farmers from neighboring counties asking for information about the Rural Sustainability Initiative, even a few calls from corporate agricultural representatives. Suddenly, interested in partnership opportunities, she immediately declined. By mid-morning, Emma had established a temporary system for managing the onslaught of attention. Interview requests were logged for later consideration. Questions about the initiative were directed to the official government channels established to handle enrollment. And through it all, she maintained her regular farm chores. The animals still needed feeding, the crops still needed tending, regardless of political developments or media interest. Around noon, a sleek government vehicle pulled into her driveway. Emma, who was harvesting late-season tomatoes in the kitchen garden, watched with curiosity as a woman in a professional pantsuit emerged, carrying a leather portfolio. "Ms. Hartwell?" the woman called, approaching with a confident stride. "I'm Diane Reynolds, Implementation Coordinator for the Rural Sustainability Initiative. The President asked me to personally handle your enrollment and begin the process of establishing Wild Winds as our demonstration site." Emma wiped her hands on her work jeans before extending one to shake. "That was fast. I wasn't expecting anyone from the program for at least a few days." Diane smiled, her professional demeanor warming slightly. "The President was quite clear that your situation should receive priority attention, and after watching your remarks at yesterday's press conference, I understand why. You articulated the vision of this initiative better than most of our policy writers." Over fresh brewed coffee at the kitchen table, now restored to its normal state after yesterday's transformation into a situation room, Diane explained the practical aspects of the program. The financial components were straightforward: immediate refinancing of Emma's existing debt through the Federal Land Bank at favorable rates, grant funding for sustainable infrastructure improvements, and operational support during the transition. Period. "The demonstration site aspect is where things get more interesting," Diane explained, spreading documents across the table. "We want Wild Winds Farm to become a regional hub for training and education in sustainable agricultural practices. That means hosting workshops, allowing supervised visits from farmers interested in transitioning to organic methods, and documenting your processes for wider distribution." Emma considered the implications. "That sounds like it could be disruptive to actually running the farm." Diane nodded, acknowledging the concern. "That's why the program includes operational support, funds specifically designated for hiring additional help to maintain production while you focus on the educational components. We don't want the demonstration sites to become just showcases. They need to remain working, profitable farms." As they discussed the details, Emma found herself impressed by the thoughtfulness of the program design. It addressed many of the practical challenges that had made sustainable farming economically precarious: access to capital, technical support, marketing assistance, infrastructure development. But more importantly, it recognized the value of the knowledge and experience farmers like Emma had developed through years of trial and error. "There's one more element I should mention," Diane said as they neared the end of their meeting. "The Justice Department has asked if you would be willing to serve as a formal witness in their case against Heartland and its affiliates. Your documentation of their practices, combined with your first-hand experience of their tactics, makes you a potentially crucial witness." Emma had anticipated this possibility since the president's initial mention of the investigation. "I'd be willing, yes, not just for my own sake, but for all the farmers who didn't have the chance to fight back." Diane made a note in her portfolio. "A Justice Department representative will contact you to arrange a formal interview. In the meantime, I recommend retaining legal counsel with expertise in these matters." She slid a card across the table. "This attorney has worked with agricultural whistleblowers before. The department will cover all legal expenses as part of the investigation." After Diane departed, with signed enrollment forms and copies of Emma's farm records, the day resumed its strange new rhythm of routine farm work, punctuated by phone calls, unexpected visitors, and media vans occasionally appearing at the end of her driveway. Emma maintained boundaries as best she could, limiting interviews and focusing on the immediate needs of her operation. Late in the afternoon, as Emma was repairing a section of fence damaged during yesterday's commotion, a familiar truck pulled up. Martha and Frank Jenkins stepped out, their expressions more relaxed than Emma had seen in months. "We're not interrupting, are we?" Martha called, already moving to take the hammer from Emma's hand. "Frank, finish that fence section while I steal Emma for a minute." Emma laughed, surrendering the tool. "What brings you two over? I thought you'd be busy with your own place now that you know you're keeping it." Martha linked her arm through Emma's, guiding her toward the house. "We've been talking with the other farmers, the Williamsons, the Garcias, old Henry Davidson, even the Patels who were about to lose their orchard. We've all been contacted about the Rural Sustainability Initiative, and we've all been asked about establishing cooperative relationships with the demonstration site." Emma nodded as they settled on the porch steps. "Ms. Reynolds mentioned that the program encourages regional coordination. It makes sense, diversified operations supporting each other rather than competing." "It's more than that," Martha said, her eyes bright with an excitement Emma hadn't seen in years. "We're thinking about establishing a formal cooperative, shared equipment, coordinated planting and harvest schedules, joint marketing, collaborative distribution, the kind of system that would let each farm maintain its independence while benefiting from collective resources." The idea resonated with Emma immediately. For years, she had watched as independent farms failed one by one, unable to compete with the economies of scale enjoyed by corporate agriculture. A cooperative structure could help level that playing field without sacrificing the values and practices that made small farms vital to rural communities. "I think it's brilliant," Emma said sincerely. "Have you discussed it with the program coordinators?" Martha nodded, barely containing her enthusiasm. "Ms. Reynolds says there's specific funding allocated for exactly these kinds of cooperative initiatives. She thinks our valley could become a model for regional agricultural revitalization." As Martha outlined the preliminary ideas the farmers had developed, Emma felt a spreading sense of hope that went beyond her own operation. The cooperative wouldn't just help individual farms survive, it would strengthen the entire agricultural community, preserving a way of life that had seemed on the verge of extinction just days earlier. "We want you to lead it," Martha said finally, cutting to the heart of her visit. "The cooperative needs a director, someone who can coordinate between all the member farms and represent us to the initiative." After everything that's happened, you're the natural choice." Emma hesitated, surprised by the request. "I'm not sure I'm qualified for something like that. I'm just a farmer who got lucky when the right person showed up on my doorstep." Martha shook her head firmly. "It wasn't luck, Emma. It was character. You've stood your ground when most of us were ready to give up. You've experimented with sustainable methods when the rest of us were afraid to take the risk. And when you had the president's ear yesterday, you used that opportunity to advocate for all of us, not just yourself." She squeezed Emma's hand. "We trust you, not because you're perfect, but because you care about this valley and the people in it." The responsibility was daunting, but as Emma considered it, she realized that the cooperative represented everything she and John had dreamed of creating. Not just a sustainable farm, but a sustainable community of farms supporting each other. It was a vision larger than any single operation, a legacy that could endure beyond any individual farmer's lifetime. "I'll need to think about it," she said finally, "but I'm honored that you'd ask." After Martha and Frank departed, promising to return with more details about the cooperative proposal, Emma found herself drawn to the eastern edge of her property, where the old maple tree stood that had been her and John's favorite spot. The ancient tree, gnarled and weathered but still vibrant, had witnessed generations of Hartwells working the land beneath its spreading branches. The wooden bench John had built still circled its massive trunk, the wood silvered with age but sturdy as ever. Emma settled onto it, feeling the connection to her late husband's strongest in this place where they had planned their dreams for Wild Wind's farm. "You wouldn't believe the day I've had," she said aloud, a habit she had developed in the years since his passing. "Actually, you wouldn't believe the past 2 days. Everything's changed, John. Everything we fought for, everything we believed in, when everyone else thought we were crazy, it's all being validated now." The evening breeze stirred the leaves above her, the sound as familiar and comforting as an old friend's voice. Emma continued her one-sided conversation, detailing the whirlwind events since Catherine had appeared on her doorstep, the presidential visit, the rural sustainability initiative, and now the cooperative proposal. "They want me to lead it," she said, still processing the offer, "to be responsible for coordinating all these farms, representing our valley to the program. I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of responsibility." She paused, smiling ruefully. "I can hear what you'd say. Ready or not, who else would you trust to do it right?" The sound of an approaching vehicle interrupted her reflections. Turning, Emma was surprised to see an official government car making its way up her driveway. For a moment, she wondered if Diane Reynolds had returned with additional paperwork, but as the car drew closer, she recognized the presidential seal on the door. Emma rose from the bench, smoothing her work clothes self-consciously as she walked, to meet the unexpected visitor. When the rear door opened, she was startled to see Catherine Morgan emerging, moving carefully, but looking considerably better than when she had been evacuated the previous day. "Miss Morgan," Emma said, genuinely pleased but confused. "I thought you were under doctor's orders to rest." Catherine smiled, adjusting the sling that supported her left arm. "I am, but I convinced them I could rest just as effectively here as in a hospital room, and there are some developments I wanted to discuss with you in person rather than over the phone." Emma led her toward the house, noting that while Catherine still moved with evident discomfort, her color had improved, and some of the tension had eased from her expression. "How are the injuries?" "Less serious than they could have been thanks to your first aid," Catherine replied. 12 stitches. In my side, sprained wrist, mild concussion, and an impressive collection of bruises. But nothing that won't heal with time. In the kitchen, now becoming a familiar meeting place for discussions that shaped the farm's future, Emma prepared tea while Catherine settled at the table. I've been monitoring the initial response to yesterday's announcement, Catherine began, accepting the steaming mug with her good hand. The public reaction has been overwhelmingly positive, especially in rural communities. The Justice Department has already received calls from farmers in 7 states reporting similar patterns of predatory lending targeting properties with water resources. Emma nodded, unsurprised. It's been happening under the radar for years. Most people assumed they were failing because small farming is inherently unsustainable in today's economy, not because they were being deliberately targeted. Exactly, Catherine agreed, which is why the educational component of the Rural Sustainability Initiative is as important as the financial support. People need to understand that sustainable, small-scale agriculture isn't just nostalgia for a bygone era. It's a vital component of our food security and environmental health. She paused, setting her mug down carefully. Which brings me to the real reason for my visit. The President was impressed by your ability to articulate the connection between water rights, sustainable agriculture, and rural community preservation during yesterday's press conference. He'd like to appoint you to the Oversight Committee for the Rural Sustainability Initiative. Emma nearly spilled her tea. What? I'm just a farmer, not a policy expert or administrator. Catherine's expression was serious but encouraging. That's precisely why your perspective is valuable. This initiative will fail if it's designed and implemented solely by bureaucrats and academics without practical farming experience. The Oversight Committee needs people who understand the day-to-day realities of sustainable agriculture, who can identify when policies look good on paper but won't work in actual fields. The offer was even more unexpected than Martha's request. Earlier in the day, Emma had never aspired to any role in national policy, had never seen herself as anything but a dedicated farmer trying to preserve her small corner of the world. Yet now, within the span of 48 hours, she had become someone whose voice mattered in discussions that would shape the future of rural America. I don't know the first thing about serving on a government committee, Emma admitted. I've never even been to Washington. Catherine smiled. None of that matters. What matters is your knowledge, your experience, and your integrity. The technical aspects can be learned. She leaned forward slightly, wincing at the movement but pressing on. Emma, do you know how rare it is for policy initiatives to include the voices of the people most affected by them? This is an opportunity to ensure that the Rural Sustainability Initiative actually serves farms like yours, rather than just looking good in press releases. As the implications sank in, Emma thought of all the times she had complained about agricultural policies clearly designed by people who had never set foot on a working farm, who didn't understand the practical challenges of implementing theoretical ideals. Now she was being offered the chance to bridge that gap, to bring the perspective of actual farmers to the table where decisions were made. The position would involve quarterly meetings in Washington, Catherine continued, with most of the work conducted remotely so you could maintain your farm operations. All expenses would be covered, and there's a stipend to compensate for your time. The initial appointment would be for 2 years, with the option to renew. Emma rose from the table, needing movement to process the cascading changes in her life. Just days ago, she had been facing the loss of everything she valued. Her farm, her independence, her connection to the land her family had worked for generations. Now she was being offered not just security for Wild Winds Farm, but a voice in shaping the future of sustainable agriculture nationwide. I need to think about this, she said finally. Between the demonstration site, the proposed cooperative, and now this committee. It's a lot to take in. Catherine nodded, understanding evident in her expression. Of course, take whatever time you need. But if I may offer one observation, you're already doing the work. Yesterday, when you spoke about what sustainable Farming means to rural communities. You are advocating for exactly the policies this committee will shape. The only difference is that now, people with the power to implement those ideas are listening. After Catherine departed, promising to return once she had recovered more fully to see how the demonstration site was developing, Emma found herself once again at the old maple tree as the sun began to set. The day's events had left her mind, whirling with possibilities that would have seemed impossible just 48 hours earlier. The cooperative, the oversight committee, the demonstration site. Each represented a different facet of the vision she and John had cultivated. A vision of farming that worked in harmony with natural systems, that strengthened rather than exploited rural communities, that produced food with integrity. Opportunities to extend that vision beyond the boundaries of Wildwind's farm were suddenly opening on all sides. As darkness fell, Emma made her decision. She would accept both roles, director of the Valley's agricultural cooperative and member of the Rural Sustainability Initiative Oversight Committee. Not because she felt particularly qualified for either position, but because both needed the perspective she could provide. The voice of someone who had nearly lost everything to the system they were trying to reform. 1 year later, Emma stood on the same porch where the president had made his historic announcement, watching as a different kind of gathering assembled on her farm. Farmers from across the region moved among demonstration plots, showcasing different sustainable techniques. University researchers collected data from the monitoring stations established throughout the property. Local food producers displayed products created from the cooperative's coordinated harvests. Wildwind's Farm's first annual sustainable agriculture field day was exceeding even the most optimistic projections. Over 300 people had registered to attend the workshops, tours, and panel discussions scheduled throughout the weekend. The parking area Emma had established in the North Field was filled with vehicles bearing license plates from 6 different states. "Quite a turnout," observed a familiar voice beside her. Emma turned to find Catherine Morgan, now fully recovered from her injuries and recently promoted to Senior Environmental Policy Advisor, surveying the scene with evident satisfaction. "More than we expected," Emma agreed, still sometimes overwhelmed by how rapidly the initiatives had grown. The cooperative is already fielding requests from farmers in neighboring counties who want to establish similar models. The Valley's agricultural cooperative, officially named Clearwater Valley Sustainable Farms, had been formally established 3 months after the president's visit. Starting with 8 founding member farms, all of which had been targeted by Heartland's acquisition scheme, it had grown to include 15 operations ranging from century farms like Wildwind's to new ventures established by young farmers drawn to the area by the innovative model. "The president sends his regrets that he couldn't attend today," Catherine said as they moved toward the main event area. "But he'll be here next month for the groundbreaking of the Rural Agricultural Education Center." The Education Center, to be built on what had once been the Jenkins Fallow South Field, represented the next phase of the Valley's transformation. Designed to provide hands-on training in sustainable farming techniques, it would serve as both an educational resource for established farmers transitioning to more sustainable methods and a training ground for the next generation of agricultural innovators. "How are you finding the balancing act?" Catherine asked, as they paused to observe a soil health demonstration being conducted beside one of the monitoring stations. "Between running your farm, directing the cooperative, and serving on the oversight committee." Emma smiled, acknowledging the challenge. "It's been an adjustment, but the farm actually runs more smoothly now that I have proper help." The operational support provided through the Rural Sustainability Initiative had allowed her to hire 2 full-time assistants, both young agricultural program graduates eager to learn organic farming methods. And the other responsibilities have been more rewarding than I expected, she continued, watching other farms in the cooperative thrive with the right support, seeing policies shaped by actual farming experience rather than just theory. It makes the extra work worthwhile. Her quarterly trips to Washington for oversight committee meetings had been intimidating at first. Emma had felt painfully out of place among policy experts and administrators in their professional attire. But she had quickly discovered that her practical knowledge of sustainable farming gave her a unique and valuable perspective that the other committee members respected and relied upon. "The president was right about you," Catherine observed as they continued their tour of the demonstration areas. "That first morning, when you spoke about the connection between sustainable agriculture and community resilience, he said you understood intuitively what most policy experts took years to grasp." Emma felt a momentary flush of pride, quickly tempered by her innate modesty. "I just know what works on actual farms, not just in theory, and I've seen firsthand what happens when control of natural resources falls into the wrong hands." The aftermath of Heartland Bank's predatory practices continued to unfold in courtrooms and congressional hearings. The Justice Department's investigation had expanded beyond Madison County, uncovering similar patterns in multiple states, all pointing to a coordinated effort to monopolize water resources through agricultural land acquisition. Emma had testified twice before congressional committees, her straightforward account of Heartland's tactics helping to shape new legislation preventing similar schemes in the future. As they approached the main pavilion where lunch would soon be served, featuring produce and products from all the cooperative's member farms, Emma caught sight of Martha Jenkins directing the volunteer team setting up the buffet tables. Nearby, Frank was leading a workshop on transitioning dairy operations to more sustainable grazing practices, his animated gestures suggesting he was describing the improvements they'd implemented over the past year. "The Jenkins farm seems to be thriving," Catherine noted following Emma's gaze. Emma nodded, feeling particular satisfaction in their recovery. "They've increased production while reducing inputs by almost 30%. Their son is coming back next month to join the operation. The first time in 3 generations, a Jenkins child has chosen farming as a career rather than leaving for opportunities elsewhere." The revival of generational farming was perhaps the most profound impact of the initiative. Throughout the valley, young people who had left for urban areas were returning, drawn by the combination of economic viability and meaningful work offered by the new model of cooperative sustainable agriculture. Some were rejoining family operations, others were establishing new farms with mentoring from established members of the cooperative. "And the aquifer?" Catherine asked, lowering her voice slightly, though the nearest group of visitors was well out of earshot. "Secure," Emma confirmed. "The Clean Water Security Act provisions are working exactly as intended. The water monitoring stations show steady improvement in quality.